DeVonta Smith suffered a hand injury on this play in the national championship game, and based on how much his hand was wrapped up when he came back onto the field, I think there's some real concern for a significant injury. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and this is your #1 source for learning about the unique medical side of the world of sports. In this video, we'll break down this play, talk about the anatomy and the mechanisms and possible injuries that Smith could have suffered here, and we'll talk about any possible implication for the rest of his career. As always, if you enjoy learning about this unique side of sports, please consider subscribing to my channel, and let's get started. Here was the play where Smith got hurt, and keep an eye on his right hand as he comes across here after bobbling this pass. So his right finger initially looks like it makes contact with an axial load directly into the defender. If we advance a little bit here, you can see his thumb pretty clearly. It looks like there's maybe a little bit of stress on his thumb here, but in this position, we can see his index finger is pretty hyperextended. Basically, if we have our hand like this and I move my finger down, that's flexion coming towards the palm, and extension is pushing it backwards. And just try it on yourself. I can't extend my finger beyond that position. And clearly it looks like Smith here has had some hyperextension, meaning it's extended beyond its normal functional limits. We can even see it looks like that metacarpal joint there is a little bit kind of more protruding from the back of his hand. And so I'd be most worried in this position about a hyperextension of that index finger. And then as we get into this position, now it looks like there's gonna be more load kind of compressing it directly into the finger this way. And his middle finger is tucked up underneath here as well. We can see kind of when it releases out here, you can see his two fingers there just kind of pop free from the defender's jersey, implying that those two fingers were under a pretty significant amount of stress here as they made contact with the defender. When Smith came off the field here, the reaction on the sideline implied again that there was probably some sort of suspected dislocation based on the amount of pain that we can see he's in, and the medical staff clearly holding onto his hand, looking like they're probably trying to reduce or put back into place a dislocated finger. The challenge is sometimes depending on how bad the dislocation is, the severity of a possible fracture, then you're not gonna be able to get it back in place. So that's of course when we see Smith being led into the medical tent. Here the staff member has a hold of his thumb and his index finger, presumably trying to help stabilize them, so also kind of giving more evidence that we gotta be most worried about that index finger. After the game, of course, Smith said basically he'll be all right, and when he was asked about his finger, and there's probably some degree here of not exactly wanting to divulge a potentially serious injury with the upcoming draft and combine. But if you look at our anatomy here, let's just talk about some of the key structures. So first off, when we talk about a hand fracture, we're talking about the metacarpal bones. I've flipped the hand around here, but the metacarpal bones are these bones that I'm highlighting here in yellow. They're the bones that sit in the palm of the hand. When we talk about a finger fracture, now we're talking more about the phalanges, which are the three bones for the index, the middle of the ring, and the pinky finger that come out through the rest of the finger. Now, specifically with a hyperextension position like we could see here on his first finger, we have to particularly worry about damage to the structures on the front side because those are the ones that are gonna be getting pulled and stretched whenever you extend that finger. On that palmar side of the hand, we of course have our flexor tendons. There's two specific muscles that have flexor tendons that run all the way up our forearm and insert with these big long tendons at various spots on our fingers. And so you can stretch those to the point where they can get injured, especially in a bad hyperextension. Much less common than a fracture or a ligament injury though. If we hide those guys, now we can see really the key structures underneath that we'd be worried about. The first is something called the volar plate. It's basically this kind of connective tissue structure that sits on that volar palmar side of the joint, kind of spanning across those two bones. And if you hyperextend or pull that joint back really hard, this can get torn and can get injured. Also, when you hyperextend one of these joints, you're putting added compression load on this metacarpal phalangeal joint or MCP joint, which can cause a fracture of this metacarpal bone or up here in the finger bone. Finally, we have these little collateral ligaments here that run along the side of the joint, kind of analogous to our MCL and our LCL. Those you're gonna think about more if there's been any deviation to the side of the finger. So that's a lot of unknowns, but with hand injuries, there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. There's a lot of small structures. And so I really wanna just give you guys a sense of kind of how complex some of this anatomy is and talk about some of the possibilities. The first big question here really is fracture severity and where is the fracture? Hand fractures can be as simple as missing hardly any time from big prolonged absences like Steph Curry had, particularly if any of the fracture involves the joint or the articular component of the bone. Those are gonna be more serious because you've got cartilage involved. If the fracture is severely displaced, meaning those two ends of the bone are really far off from one another, more likely to have surgery, also more potential complications. The soft tissues around the finger in terms of these ligaments, this volar plate, those really aren't going to be as severe of injuries, but definitely depending on severity of possible fracture, I think that's the biggest thing we got to think about. Long term, I don't think this is going to cause any issues whatsoever. But short term, as you're thinking about upcoming draft, yeah, I think there's a possibility it could limit how much he can participate, depending on how severe a possible injury is. I certainly wouldn't expect this to still be a lingering problem when summer camps would start and certainly the next NFL season, but just in this short-term period over the next few weeks to maybe month or so, yeah, there could be some limitations in his pass catching, which could affect workouts. I think he's done enough already to not affect his draft stock, but I think here we're just thinking short-term limitations, very, very unlikely just from how this looked and kind of how hand and finger injuries go to have any long-term ramifications for the rest of his career. If we get more information, we'll try to do an updated video to teach you guys a little bit more specifics, but I hope you enjoyed this look at sort of some of the mechanisms here with the play, a little bit of review of the anatomy, and then possibilities both short and long term. That's it for the video. Let me know any questions down below as always, and until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.